When Margaret Whitmore placed the black ribbon beside Amara's teacup, she did it with the kind of smile that made cruelty look civilized. "The royal auction will be very crowded tonight," she said softly. "This pass will help staff know where to place you." Amara lowered her eyes to the ribbon. It was not a guest pass. It was a service badge. Across the breakfast table, Daniel Whitmore stiffened, but only slightly. Not enough to matter. Never enough to matter. Margaret lifted her coffee with perfect grace. "I simply thought it might save you embarrassment. Events like this can be culturally overwhelming." The room went still. Rain tapped lightly against the long windows of the Whitmore estate outside Cape Town, and somewhere beyond the dining room, silverware clinked faintly in the kitchen. Amara looked back at her mother-in-law. Her expression did not break. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I usually know exactly where I belong." Margaret's smile sharpened at the edges. Daniel glanced at his wife as if he wanted to say something, as if he wanted to finally become the kind of man who said something. But wanting and doing had never been the same thing with Daniel Whitmore. So he said only, "Mother?" Margaret turned to him with an elegant shrug. "What? I'm trying to be helpful." No one spoke after that. Not Margaret, who had spent 40 years mastering the art of social execution without ever raising her voice. Not Daniel, who had inherited an empire but not the courage to challenge the woman who built half of it with her bare hands and the other half with everyone else's fear. And not Amara, who had learned during 3 years inside the Whitmore family that silence was often the only dignified response to people determined to misunderstand you. At least, that was what the family believed. They believed Amara Okoye Whitmore was gentle in the way powerless women were gentle. They believed her softness came from dependence. They believed that because she ran a small tea room near the V&A waterfront called House of Baobab, because she wore simple linen dresses in the daytime, because she never corrected people when they misjudged her, and because she never once used money, status, or influence to make anyone smaller than herself. And in the Whitmore world, only people with nothing to show stayed that quiet. The Whitmores were old Atlantic money. Shipping, insurance, luxury hospitality, private ports, art foundations, and enough board seats across Europe and Southern Africa to make ministers answer their calls on the first ring. Margaret Whitmore ruled the family with a polished intensity that made most rooms rearrange themselves around her. She was never loud. She never needed to be. Entire cities had bent around women like Margaret long before ordinary people realized what power even looked like. Daniel was her only son. Educated in London, trained in Geneva, admired in business magazines, spoken of as one of those men who seemed born inside tailored suits and inherited certainty. He had not married the woman his mother wanted. He had married Amara. Nigerian by birth, educated partly in Lagos, partly abroad, raised between discipline and grace, beautiful without performance, reserved without insecurity. And to the horror of Cape Town society, she had seemed entirely uninterested in impressing anyone. Margaret had decided immediately that this could not be innocence. It had to be strategy. But strategy toward what? Amara did not attend charity circuits every weekend. She did not flirt with cameras. She did not collect titled friends or pose beside borrowed diamonds. She did not talk too much at dinners or offer opinions that could be quoted later. She simply existed with the calmness of someone who did not need permission to belong anywhere. That unsettled Margaret from the beginning. Because truly secure people often frightened the insecure more than obvious ambition ever could. By noon, Amara was back at House of Baobab. The tea room smelled of cardamom, cedar, orange peel, and black tea steeping slowly in polished copper kettles. Sunlight spread through woven lampshades, casting soft patterns across terracotta walls and dark wood shelves lined with books, ceramics, and small framed photographs of markets, coastlines, and women laughing somewhere far from the world Margaret Whitmore ruled. "Are you going tonight?" Zuri asked. Amara glanced up from the ledger she was reviewing. Zuri, her manager, stood near the counter arranging a tray of date cakes with the expression of someone already prepared to dislike the answer. "To the auction," Zuri clarified. Amara smiled faintly. "Yes." Zuri exhaled. "I hate those people, and I've only met them twice." Amara laughed softly. That, more than anything, made customers love her. Her laugh never sounded forced. It never sounded strategic. It sounded like relief had somehow learned elegance. Zuri folded her arms. "Your husband's mother gave me the kind of look people reserve for muddy shoes." "She has range," Amara said. "Amara." This time, Amara looked up properly. Zuri lowered her voice. "Why do you keep letting them assume you're small?" For a brief moment, something unreadable moved through Amara's eyes. Then she closed the ledger. "Because people reveal themselves more honestly when they believe they're above consequences." Zuri stared at her. That sounded expensive. Amara only smiled. What almost no one knew was that House of Baobab had never been Amara's whole life. It was simply the life she allowed the world to see most easily. 7 years earlier, long before she married Daniel Whitmore, long before Margaret Whitmore had ever spoken her name with concealed disdain, Amara had founded the Sankofa Heritage Trust through a private international legal structure spread across Lagos, Accra, Nairobi, and Geneva. Its mission was quietly radical. Recover looted African royal objects, sacred artifacts, ceremonial archives, and privately held pieces that had disappeared into the collections of old European families, discreet museums, and billionaire vaults. Some were bought back legally through private negotiation. Some were restored. Some were authenticated after decades of being mislabeled. And some, when necessary, were won back in rooms full of people who assumed the continent they came from had long ago lost the right to ask for them. For 6 years, the trust had operated with almost mythical discretion. No interviews, no verified photographs of its founder, no award ceremonies, no panel appearances, only impossible results. A Benin altar screen returned from a secret estate in Belgium. A lost Ashanti regalia inventory recovered from a dissolved auction house archive. A sacred Ethiopian manuscript restored under military-grade security. The art press called the founder many things. The most persistent nickname was simple: the woman in shadow. And tonight, in Cape Town, the Whitmore Royal Auction House would unveil a centerpiece lot that had already set 3 continents talking. The crown of Queen Nandile. A gold ceremonial crown set with river sapphires and carved ivory inlays taken more than a century ago during a punitive colonial raid, then hidden for decades inside private ownership records too expensive and too politically inconvenient for ordinary institutions to fight. Now it had resurfaced. And Margaret Whitmore, proud patron of the evening, intended to turn the event into one more theater of hierarchy. At 7:30, the Royal Hall glittered like a promise money tells itself. Glass towers of champagne, black marble floors reflecting chandelier light.
A raised auction stage beneath velvet curtains. Security discreet enough to look decorative and expensive enough not to be. Margaret arrived in silver silk and old diamonds, receiving greetings the way empires receive tribute.
Daniel stood beside her in a black tuxedo, handsome in the tired, careful way of a man who had spent too much of his life pleasing the wrong person. Guests noticed when Amara entered, not dramatically, not loudly, but enough, because she did not look overwhelmed. She looked composed. She wore a long black gown with a structured neckline and sleeves that skimmed her wrists. No excessive jewels, no theatrical styling. Only small gold earrings, a smooth, low knot at the nape of her neck, and the kind of stillness that made louder women seem overworked. Margaret's eyes found her immediately. "You came through the front after all," she said when Amara approached. Amara glanced once at the service badge still tucked into her clutch. "I thought I'd try something adventurous." A few nearby guests smiled before quickly pretending they had not. Margaret turned away first. That was always her first sign of discomfort. At 8:15, guests were guided into the main auction chamber. Place cards gleamed under candlelight. Amara's card was not among the central donor tables. It was set near the side aisle, close enough to witness importance, far enough not to be mistaken for it. Margaret had arranged that personally. Daniel noticed. Of course he noticed. "Amara," he said quietly, "I can speak to them." She looked at him. There was no anger in her face. That made it worse. "You could," she said, "but you won't." He opened his mouth, then closed it. Because once again, she had told the truth too gently for him to defend himself against it. The auction began with lesser pieces: bronze ritual vessels, carved stools, beaded necklaces from private estates. Telephone bidders murmured through headsets. Wealth moved invisibly. Paddles rose like small acts of appetite. Then the lights shifted. The auctioneer stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "before tonight's principal lot is opened, the board of the Whitmore Royal Auction House has authorized a special announcement regarding the future of the Nandile crown." The room brightened with interest. Margaret leaned back slightly, satisfied. She loved a controlled surprise, especially when she believed she controlled it. The auctioneer continued. "As many of you know, the return of the Nandile crown has been the subject of legal, diplomatic, and conservation negotiations for nearly 11 years. Tonight, we are honored to confirm that, before bidding even begins, a fully funded restitution offer has already been secured." A ripple passed through the room. "What? By whom?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. The auctioneer smiled. "The benefactor behind that offer has, until now, remained anonymous." Now the room became truly attentive. Daniel frowned. Margaret sat straighter, and Amara folded her hands in her lap as if nothing in the world had shifted at all. The screen behind the stage lit up. A single name appeared in gold letters: Sankofa Heritage Trust. The room erupted into whispers. People knew that name. Collectors knew it with resentment. Curators knew it with awe. Governments knew it with gratitude. The trust had embarrassed institutions twice its age and outmaneuvered men who believed African heritage was safest when owned by people far away from Africa. Margaret's face lost a degree of color. Not much, just enough for Daniel to see it. The auctioneer lifted his hand again. And tonight, for the first time, the founder and principal trustee of Sankofa Heritage will be publicly identified. Silence dropped hard across the chamber. Amara rose. Not hurriedly, not triumphantly, just with the kind of calm that made panic belong to everyone else. She stepped into the aisle. Several guests physically turned in their chairs. Daniel stared at his wife like a man discovering an entire landscape had existed beside him for years while he kept calling it a view. The auctioneer's voice rang clear. The founder of Sankofa Heritage Trust is Mrs. Amara Okoye Whitmore. The silence afterward felt almost sacred. Then came the shock. You could see it move. Across donor tables, across diplomats' faces, across investors who had once bragged at dinner about outbidding unnamed African interests, never realizing the woman they were mocking might one day stand 6 feet away in black silk. Margaret did not blink. That was how Daniel knew she was rattled. Amara walked to the stage through a corridor of staring wealth and accepted the microphone. For a moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice soft enough to force people closer, she began. The crown of Queen Nandile should never have needed rescuing by money, she said. It should have been allowed to remain where memory already understood it. No one moved. Tonight is not a purchase, she continued. It is a correction, a late one, an imperfect one, but a correction all the same. Her eyes swept the room once, not with revenge, not with bitterness, but with complete clarity. I have spent years watching people confuse possession with legitimacy. Owning a thing does not make it yours in any meaningful moral sense. Sometimes history is only waiting for the right witness to stop mistaking theft for tradition. The room stayed motionless. Then her gaze paused, only briefly, on Margaret. Dignity, she said, is not loud. It does not beg. It does not announce itself every 5 minutes in order to feel real. It simply waits until the room is finally ready to recognize it. And that was when the chamber broke. Applause rose first from the museum delegation, then from the diplomats, then from people who sensed history and wanted to be seen clapping when it arrived. Margaret remained seated. Daniel stood. He did not even seem to realize he had stood. He was looking at Amara with something far more painful than admiration. Recognition. Too late, but unmistakable. The auction continued only as ceremony after that. The crown was formally transferred through the trust's secured restitution structure. The legal documents had been completed hours earlier. Margaret, who had spent the evening designing Humiliation like an interior arrangement, now sat inside a public reversal so complete she could not even challenge it without humiliating herself further. But the worst part had not yet come. Because after the auction, at the private patron dinner upstairs, the chairman of Whitmore Maritime greeted Amara like royalty. Not social royalty, something rarer, necessary royalty. Mrs. Whitmore, he said warmly, I've been hoping to meet you. We owe your office a great deal. Margaret looked from him to Amara. What office? She asked, too quickly. The chairman smiled, unaware he was detonating a family. The Debt Stabilization Office in Geneva, of course. Sankofa's sovereign infrastructure arm acquired the Malvern shipping paper 18 months ago. Daniel's face changed first, then Margaret's. Whitmore Maritime had nearly been dragged into a dangerous refinancing crisis a year and a half earlier after a port expansion collapsed and insurers refused exposure. The family had been told an anonymous African-linked private fund had quietly bought the paper and prevented predatory takeover pressure. Margaret had called it lucky. Daniel had called it a miracle. Neither had known the miracle was eating breakfast with them every morning. Margaret stared at Amara. You financed Whitmore Maritime? Amara's expression remained even. I protected the workers and the ports connected to it. Your family happened to benefit. The chairman laughed lightly. That modesty is unfair to the truth. Without her structure, your shipping group would have lost 2 corridors and half its bargaining power in East Africa. Daniel looked physically ill. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Amara turned to him. The candlelight caught the gold in her skin and the sadness in her eyes. "Because I wanted one place in my life where I could be loved before I was useful." Daniel lowered his gaze like he had been struck. The dinner lasted another hour, but for Margaret Whitmore, it was already over. For Daniel, something else had begun. Regret. The kind that does not arrive all at once, but rather in 1,000 returning scenes. Every dinner where he watched his mother reduce Amara to a decorative inconvenience. Every silence he called strategic. Every moment he saw pain in his wife's face and convinced himself that peace was more mature than courage. Peace. Men like Daniel loved that word when it protected their comfort. 3 weeks later, another invitation arrived. This one from London. The Imperial Maritime Council, an emergency governance dinner involving Whitmore Maritime, its European lenders, and the African infrastructure partners who could determine its future. Margaret welcomed the invitation like a drowning woman spotting a familiar shore. Business, she thought, was different from culture. A museum audience could romanticize a woman in black silk and historical morality. Boardrooms were colder, more practical, less vulnerable to spectacle. If the auction had elevated Amara socially, perhaps finance would place her back where Margaret preferred her, tolerated, not central. That illusion lasted exactly until the seating cards were revealed. Margaret was placed mid-table, Daniel beside a Belgian insurer, 2 Gulf investors near the window, and at the head of the room, beside the council chair and across from the restructuring committee, sat Mrs. Amara Okoye Whitmore. Margaret felt something dangerously close to panic. Seats like that were not decorative. They represented leverage. Daniel found Amara near the terrace before dinner began. London rain blurred the city lights behind her. She wore cream this time, not black. Softer, quieter, almost cruel in its gentleness. "Amara," he said. She turned. He had rehearsed speeches for 2 weeks. Apologies, explanations, histories, childhood loyalties, fear, habit, weakness disguised as diplomacy. Now, standing in front of her, all of it sounded embarrassing. So he asked the smallest, honest question instead. "Did you ever trust me?" Amara looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. That was the tragedy. The words opened something inside him that had been rotting for years. "I loved you." "I know." "No," he said, more sharply than he intended. Not politely, not halfway. "I love you. I was just—" He stopped. Cowardly, he thought. Conditioned, he almost said. Torn, he might have chosen in another version of himself, but none of those words would improve the truth. Amara helped him by speaking it for him. "You were comfortable," she said softly, "and my loneliness was the price." Dinner was called before he could answer. Inside, silver candle holders threw light across crystal glasses and legal folders. The council chair opened with numbers, obligations, route exposure, labor volatility, financing pressures, and governance requirements tied to future corridor access. Margaret relaxed incrementally. This was language she understood. Risk, control, penalties. Then the council chair turned toward Amara. "Before we proceed," he said, "we should formally acknowledge that the Kisiwa Corridor Initiative will move forward only under the governance framework proposed by Sankofa Infrastructure. Mrs. Whitmore, the floor is yours." Amara stood. No dramatic pause, no stagecraft, just composure. Kisiwa is not merely a logistics project, she said. It connects inland producers, coastal labor, heritage zones, and university development across 4 African jurisdictions. For too long, African routes have been financed as extraction channels rather than economic ecosystems. Margaret watched the room. They were listening to Amara the way serious people listen when the future has already decided to speak. Amara continued. Sankofa will back the corridor, but not under the old Whitmore governance model. A document packet was distributed. Directors opened it. Margaret's breath caught. The proposal transferred strategic oversight into a joint structure with labor protections, cultural preservation covenants, local equity participation, and independent board review. And if Whitmore Maritime refused, the corridor would proceed without them. Their most important African expansion of the decade would move past them like a tide. Margaret looked up in disbelief. You would cut us out? Amara met her eyes calmly. No, she said. I would stop rewarding a structure that mistakes inheritance for entitlement. The silence that followed was cleaner than any public humiliation. It had no audience hunger, no spectacle, only truth and consequence. One of the lenders cleared his throat. From a risk standpoint, Mrs. Whitmore's framework is stronger than the current one. Another nodded. And politically more sustainable. Margaret turned to Daniel, expecting alignment, rescue, instinct. Instead, she found her son staring at his wife with devastated clarity. For once in his life, he was no longer confused about which side of a moral line he stood on. He had simply arrived too late. The vote to enter revised negotiations passed before dessert. Whitmore Maritime would survive, but not as Margaret's private kingdom. As guests rose, Margaret remained seated. For several seconds, she looked older than Daniel had ever seen her. Not weaker, just stripped of performance. Amara, she said quietly. Amara paused. Margaret swallowed once. I misjudged you. Amara's face did not harden. Somehow that mercy made the moment harder. No, she replied softly. You judged me exactly the way the world taught you to. You simply did not expect the world to stop agreeing. Margaret closed her eyes briefly. That was as close to an apology as pride could survive. Later that night, Daniel found Amara alone in the hotel conservatory, where rain slid over glass and the city below looked distant enough to forgive. He stood in front of her with none of his usual polish left. If I ask you not to leave me, he said, would that be selfish? Amara smiled sadly. Yes. I can change. You probably can. Then why does it sound like goodbye? Because it was. Because some endings announce themselves loudly, and some are built quietly over years of being unseen. Amara stepped closer. She touched his hand once. Not coldly, not angrily. With tenderness so devastating it nearly broke him. I needed to be chosen while it was still difficult, she said. Not after the room had already clapped for me. Daniel's eyes filled. She had never humiliated him. That, more than anything, made the loss unbearable. He could have fought his mother 100 times in small, ordinary moments. A sentence at breakfast, a seat card changed at dinner, a hand placed reassuringly over his wife's when someone insulted her in front of him. He had failed not in one grand betrayal, but in 1,000 convenient silences. Amara saw him understand that. And because she had once loved him deeply, she did not prolong his pain. I hope, she whispered, One day, you become brave enough to love someone without asking them to shrink for your comfort.
She let go of his hand, and this time, when she walked away, Daniel did not follow. He understood at last that apology could not always compete with history. Months later, under open sky in Nigeria, the crown of Queen Nandile was unveiled inside a new heritage pavilion funded by Sankofa and governed by a local board of historians, conservators, and community elders. There were no chandeliers, no private donor tables, no white gloves carrying other people's memory for profit. Children came in school uniforms. Old women stood quietly with tears in their eyes. A historian touched the display glass and said, almost to herself, "It came home."
Amara stood near the back of the room in a simple cream dress, watching the line move slowly forward. Not hidden, not showcased, just present. The way she had always wanted power to feel. Zuri, who had flown in for the opening and spent the entire morning pretending not to cry, leaned close and whispered, "You know what your problem is?" Amara smiled. "I have several. Be specific." "You make dignity look glamorous." Amara laughed then, softly and fully, and the sound drifted into the bright air like something unburdened at last. The press would later write about the crown, the trust, the legal elegance of the restitution structure, the economic implications of the Kisiwa corridor, and the mystery of the woman who had reshaped rooms full of powerful people without ever sounding hungry for their approval. But the truth of Amara's life was simpler. She had never needed the world to discover her value. She had only needed to stop living among people who benefited from pretending not to see it. In Cape Town, Daniel Whitmore kept one photograph in a drawer he never showed anyone. It was not from a gala, not from London, not from the auction that had humiliated his mother and exposed his own failure. It was from an ordinary Tuesday at House of Baobab. Amara behind the counter, sleeves rolled lightly, pouring tea for an elderly customer, and smiling as if time itself had decided to rest near her for a while. He looked at that photograph sometimes and understood, with a pain so clean it no longer needed drama, that the most extraordinary thing about his wife had never been her wealth, or her power, or her ability to make elite rooms fall silent. It had been her kindness. And the greatest mistake of his life was assuming kindness would wait forever for courage. As for Margaret Whitmore, she changed in ways society would never notice and therefore never reward. She stopped interrupting women at board meetings. She stopped using charity as costume. She sold 3 pieces from her private collection after asking, for the first time in her life, where they had actually come from. It did not erase her. It did not redeem history. But shame, when it is honest, can still become instruction. And somewhere between loss and late understanding, Margaret finally learned what Amara had known from the beginning. Class without humanity is only choreography. Status without dignity is noise. And a woman does not become powerful because a ballroom finally turns to look at her. Sometimes she was powerful all along. The room was simply late.